welcome to Zip Over To Zack. My name's Zach Polanksi. I'm a Green Party London Assembly candidate, supporting the work of two incredible Green Party Assembly members, which is Sean Berry and Caroline Russell. For those who don't know a lot about the Assembly, now is not the time to talk too much about it, but I can't resist a little bit, which is they're responsible for things like housing, transport, the environment in London, and obviously at the moment they're working incredibly hard, getting London moving again, but also in a safe way. So still encouraging mask use, social distancing, etc. When I was asked to do this weekly web series as a guest host for a little while, I was really excited. And one of the reasons was I realized I could give platforms to issues that I really care about. So we've already done something about proportional representation. We've talked about the climate emergency. I really hope to get universal basic income in there at some point too. One of the issues, though, deepest to my heart for a long time has been the refugee crisis, the humanitarian crisis we have going on all around the world. Obvious examples in Syria and Afghanistan, and then less obvious examples too. But I think it's incumbent on us all, whether we work in politics, whether we work in education, or just a citizen of the world, to make sure that we are doing the most we can to help the most vulnerable. So in a moment, I've got two fantastic guests. We're going to be having a short 20-minute chat about the refugee crisis. I already know it won't be long enough to really have a deep insight into it, but what I'm really hoping is that anyone watching this who's maybe not thought about these issues before, or it's on their periphery, just has a time to just focus just for this little short amount of time and wonder what we can all do to help and where we need to go next. Just before we do, just want to talk about what's happened in the news this week, and something pretty obvious has happened, and that's been the crisis that's going on in our schools. Gavin Williamson did make the U-turn yesterday, and I just want to congratulate people like the Young Greens that were immediately out there with a petition to say reverse the algorithm. It is unconscionable, this complete idea that you were going to be awarded a grade based on the postcode of where you lived or the quality or class of school that you went to. And that's something you shouldn't have been able to get away with in Victorian England, and you certainly shouldn't be able to get away with it in 2020. So we've had this reverse. Gavin Williamson should resign. This has been a major mistake. Now, with everything related to coronavirus, I think we always need to be careful that we don't just say, you didn't see this coming, because you know, it's fair enough with some things that there will be disruption, but we could have seen this coming for a long time, and people like the Green Party have been calling on the government to make sure that we had a resilient plan in place for education. That just wasn't there. We have the problem that we have on so many different issues that the Tories have a 80-strong majority, and so is he going to resign? I don't know, but I think it's still important that we stick to the right thing to do and call for him to resign. And congratulations to those young people who are now in a better place, but also commiserations for how much chaos is already going on at a tricky time. On to an even trickier topic though now. I'd like to introduce my two guests. The first guest that I want to introduce is the former leader of the Green Party. She has been so loud and amplifying so many voices on this particular issue for such a long time. She's now in the House of Lords, and it's fantastic to have her as a Green peer. And that guest is, of course, Natalie Bennett. Lovely to have you on the show, Natalie.
Lovely to be with you.
And the guest that I'm going to be asking my first questions to, thank you. We've got a slight delay there, the joy of Zoom and technical issues. And then the other guest that I want to introduce you to, I'm probably going to horribly mispronounce his name now, so I'm going to ask him to correct me. I've got Ahmed Al-Rashid. Ahmed Al-Rashid is actually a Syrian refugee himself. He also worked for UNICEF for a few years, and since coming to London, I think in 2015, he's done a master's in violence, conflict and development. So he's a pretty qualified person to talk about these issues. So if I can turn to Ahmed first of all, I imagine that on these kind of shows and on TV, you're constantly having to recount your journey over to the UK. So I certainly don't want to ask you to fully associate into it on a Tuesday morning, but if you could kind of give us a brief overview of where you came from and what that journey was like.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Good to be joined, or good to join this interview. My name is Ahmed, and I am originally from Aleppo, Syria. So I was born and raised in Aleppo, living in a relatively peaceful place back in Syria up till 2011, when the Arab Spring started. Never ever imagined that I would be forced to leave my home, my family and my loved ones. And then, as I said, the crisis, the uprising started in Syria. I was forced to move, so I moved out to Syria, to Iraqi Kurdistan, where I lived for about 2.5 years working mainly with Syrian refugees. And then the Iraqi, crisis started also with ISIS attacking and taking control of large parts of Iraq and Syria. Then, for me, it feels at that time, moving or fleeing kind of, from the frying pan literally into the fire. So I had to move out of the whole region. Then I decided to move and come to the UK, and I had to take a 55-day journey. So crossing borders, seas in the back of cars and lorries, and with smugglers, and then eventually I made it to the UK in 2015.
Thank you, Ahmed. And I'm sure this doesn't need saying, but I'm going to say it nonetheless. Complete solidarity with what you've been through, both for myself on an individual level and from the Green Party, who absolutely stand with you. In terms of objections that you hear on Twitter and on social media, I don't want to dive into them too much, but one of the questions that's always asked is, why the UK? Why don't people go to safer countries that are nearby? So I guess gently asking you, what was it about the UK?
Well, I think that's a really good question and a very valid question that lots of people get asked. I think if you look at the number of Syrians, I would say the vast majority, you're talking just over 5 million people who are taking refuge in the neighboring countries. And it's places like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq who are, shouldering the responsibility of hosting the vast majority of Syrians. A small percentage, a tiny percentage of those people who decided to move on, because you're talking almost next year, it will be 1 decade since the conflict in Syria started. So you're talking about the entire generation now, growing up in refugee camps with no right to education most of the time, no access to health facilities. And the whole situation seems to be getting worse and worse, with most of these countries now, closing more of the borders and adopting kind of more kind of, difficult, I would say, situation for most of these families. So for me, I've decided to move on because, as I said, initially Europe, the UK was never my intention. I've always lived and stayed near the borders. This is the hope for me, was to return home when the situation allows. But unfortunately, that did not happen. That this still has not happened. I do not know when into the future that will happen. And I wanted to again, rebuild a life for myself, for my family. And the UK was the option for 2 simple reasons. The first reason was my family was in Eastern Aleppo at that time during the bombing and the shelling in 2016. And the UK, after I arrived, offered me, a family reunion visa within 29 days. You can imagine 29 days in that situation is a life-saving situation. I had other people who moved to other countries and it took them about 2 years or sometimes 3 years, living in a conflict zone for 2 or 3 years, not knowing what's going to happen. My worst enemy at that time was time itself, and the UK helped me. The other reason for me also was the language. I did English language, I did literature 4 years back in Syria. So I did, starting from Chaucer, Shakespeare, the Renaissance, the Victorian era. So I got a good grasp of language, culture, literature, which helped me, integrate and start, contributing and giving back to the community that helped and supported me. So immediately after I arrived, I managed to get a scholarship. I did my master's in violence, conflict and development at SOAS. And straight away after I finished my master's, I started working. It's just been over 3 years since I started, working full-time employment. This might not have been possible in other countries where I didn't have the possibility or grasp of language or culture.
Thank you. That's an incredibly impassioned answer. I think a really, really good example too, an advocate of why we should be encouraging people most to come in terms of getting people into work, into the tax system and contributing to our country, because our country, after all, is a nation built on immigration and the contribution of everyone. For people watching at home, if you do have any questions for Ahmed or for Natalie, please do make sure you put them in the chat and I'll put them to them. Turning to Natalie now. Natalie, I remember a really powerful moment in the 2015 TV debates was you being able to hold David Cameron to account on live TV about the Syrian crisis. And I think at that time, a lot of people saw it as a niche issue that hadn't hit the news in quite the same way. But for a long time, you've been such a powerful advocate.
Well, thank you very much. And it's an issue that's very close to my own heart, in part because, of course, as soon as I open my mouth, most people realise that I am myself a migrant to Britain, a very privileged migrant. But I really think that we have to think about the state of the world, look around the world. And I was preparing for this, I was having a look to see back what I've said in the past about refugee issues. And I came across a video that I made at the London Arms Fair. And, the state of the world, we as Britain have a huge responsibility for the state of the world, our colonial history, our history of military adventurism in Iraq and Afghanistan, issues, actions that have had a real global impact. And we have a very unstable world now. 1% of the world's population are displaced. And yet the UK, contrary to popular belief, takes a tiny fraction of the world's refugees. As Ahmed was saying, most people stay in places like Jordan, in Turkey, in places that are much closer to where they've fled from, often with the hope of going back. And what I also have long been passionate about and been doing quite a lot on work on lately is the refugees who do make it here. Unfortunately, we treat them absolutely awfully. I mean, the Green Party has long been campaigning, calling for an end for immigration detention, which is people who've committed no crime can be locked up indefinitely. And that's something even quite a lot of Tory MPs and peers are campaigning to change. And we may well see that happening with the immigration bill that's coming to the Lords soon. And I've also been doing quite a lot of work because I'm based in Sheffield, with the treatment of people housed now in urban house and other immigration housing, provided often by outsourced privatised providers, grossly inadequate. And the advantage of being in the House of Lords is, for example, people contacted me with grave concerns, and I actually went up and spoke outside Urban House to some of the Urban House residents, and the way they're being treated is absolutely dreadful. And I was able to arrange a meeting with the minister. I can't say that we really got anywhere from it, but at least I was really able to draw to the attention of the minister the way people were being treated. And unfortunately, what happened a couple of weeks after that was there was an outbreak of coronavirus at Urban House, and lots of people were shifted in a hurry. But I just keep looking for people who really need help. And we need to really change the whole dialogue about refugees and immigration in the UK. And it's important to set those facts out and explain how badly we're treating people.
Absolutely. I know because you're relatively new to the House of Lords, one of the first things you kind of jumped on was the Dubs Amendment, and there was kind of a whole mess about that between the Commons and the Lords. Would you mind giving us a little bit of history about that and where it's up to now?
Okay, well, it's named after Lord Dubs, the very fine campaigning Labour peer, who has been working on this issue of unaccompanied refugee children who should have the right to come to the UK because they've got family here. Now, the government themselves says regularly, again and again, yes, these are some of the most vulnerable people in the world, unaccompanied child refugees. They're an incredibly difficult situation. And the Dubs Amendment simply would have guaranteed the continuation of arrangements which haven't been very good, but at least set out some rules. Now, the government keeps saying this is a subject of negotiation. Well, I don't think we should be negotiating about the fate of children. We should be saying, refugees welcome, but particularly these most vulnerable children who already have family here in the UK. It's definitely the best place for them to be. And that's something, that will be coming up again, I think, in the immigration bill, which will be coming back after recess. And so we're going to keep fighting on this. And we have this problem as the government, says, oh, yes, we're going to sort this out, it'll be fine. But, as you were alluding to at the start, that's something we've heard many, many times before.
Thank you, Natalie. Turning back to Ahmed, it seems clear that there's a bit of a battle here for hearts and minds in terms of the British public to make them realise how horrific this situation is, and also for legislation to be better in the future. Where would you like to see things go next, and how can people help if someone's watching?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for this question. I think this is a very important question. Again, the sad thing today is, if you look at the media, is that lots of negativity is coming out of the media, and it is a very sad thing when you see some of the most vulnerable people are suddenly being scapegoated on the media, and you've got people attacking them. which is, as I said, this is very disheartening. I think for me, one of the key things that I would suggest is, again, is that people need to know that the vast majority of people do not want to leave their homes. You know, looking at a place like Syria, before 2011, there was no refugees like coming from Syria. In fact, Syria was a country that received many people, you know, other refugees from neighboring countries and further afield. So, I mean, one of the ways that people can, you know, help and support, say in the context of the UK, I mean, one of the things that I think really is very important to highlight here is that the UK itself is leading the way when it comes to refugee resettlement across Europe. You know, the UK itself gave sanctuary to over 20,000 Syrian refugees who came through the Vulnerable People Resettlement Scheme, which is something, you know, quite important. But also, I think there should be other means, like, you know, providing family reunion, more options for family reunion, you know, humanitarian visas and student visas for those who want to come and study from a refugee background. And even like work, you know, like you've got, you know, probably the new immigration system, the points system, you know, probably could also look at how refugees and or asylum seekers can be incorporated into this. And on a practical level here in the UK, I think lots of things that people can do to help and support. Like I myself, when I got to the United Kingdom, I was almost I became a homeless. So a group of people take me in, and a group called Refugees at Home helped and supports me. Another group also campaigned for me to get a scholarship. So this was the STAR, Student Action for Refugees. So there were really many ways that you can really help and support. And it does not have to be, you know, a massive thing, because every little thing, you know, helps. Even like, you know, speaking up, campaigning, you know, in kind of, you know, engaging in conversation. These are all very helpful and useful things, I think.
Thank you, and thanks again for all the work you do, Ahmed. I know, for instance, every time that the refugee crisis is in the news, I feel like Channel 4 and the BBC rush to get you on there, and you're always a fantastic advocate to talk about these issues. So thank you for everything you do. Turning to Natalie again, really it's the same question, Natalie, in terms of what next, what would you like to see happen, and what are you going to make happen? Not too much pressure.
Well, I mean, the first thing is I think we need to interrogate this phrase refugee crisis a little, because there is a refugee crisis around the world. And there is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of danger that we've seen some 4,000 people cross the channel, mostly unsafely this year. But it's not the fact that Britain is seeing a crisis of huge numbers of refugees arriving. Refugees are less than a tenth of the percentage of people who came to the UK last year. The vast majority of people come as migrants under other arrangements, other routes. And so I think it's really important we don't say that Britain is facing a refugee crisis. We say that the world is facing a refugee crisis. And we have to go back to issues of how do we give people a safe route to come here if they have good reason to actually claim refugee status. Now, one of my roles in the House of Lords is I'm actually co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong. And one of the things we've seen a very different kind of approach from the government is, since we've seen the terrible imposition from Beijing of the national security law in Hong Kong, the government has come out and announced, to the considerable vexation of Beijing, that it's going to open routes to allow British national overseas passport holders and their relatives and potentially others to come to the UK. So we've seen, it's really interesting. And I think what we have to do is link all of this up and say, we need to say that all refugees are welcome, that we need to ensure that people are able to come here. And with Hong Kong potential refugees, China has started to say that it may not recognise British national overseas passports. Britain may have to really work a way to ensure that people are able to get out of Hong Kong and reach the UK. They may include some of the democracy protesters, people who are particularly in need of asylum from the Chinese government. And so if we're going to start setting up legal, safe routes for people from Hong Kong, then we should be setting up legal safe routes for everybody all around the world who needs that refugee status. So that's one area that I'll very much be working on. Opposition to immigration detention, as I said, there's a lot of Tory support in that area and certainly can be worked on. And the government's, we started a year ago, or best part of a year ago, after the 2019 election, everyone's saying, oh, the government's got a terribly stable majority, but actually this is a very, very unstable government. So working towards dealing with immigration detention, dealing with safe routes, trying to tackle how people are actually treated when they're here claiming asylum. And I think we've also really got to keep working on the issues of security and what makes a safer world. And it's not arms exports, it's not military adventures, it's actually working out, positively, diplomatically standing up for human rights and democracy. And again, because of the historical background and because of people feeling somewhat guilty of the handover of the people of Hong Kong that happened, there's going to be real opportunities to use that Hong Kong case to talk much more broadly about how Britain's policy should change.
That's amazing. And that's a very strange, I'll admit, a connection I hadn't made in terms of thinking about the Hong Kong issue in the light of a refugee issue. I think also that point about refugee crisis and being very clear that we're talking about the global refugee crisis, because the UK doesn't have a refugee crisis, is also a really good distinction. Just to finish up, since I've got you on, Natalie, you're in this very peculiar position of being in the House of Lords with Jenny Jones, but wanting to abolish the House of Lords. Just with the final minute, I just wanted to ask you, how kind of is it being in an establishment you want to get rid of?
Well, it's an enormous amount of fun. When I went in my maiden speech, I said, I'm bringing the politics of the anti-fracking movement, the climate strikers. I'm bringing a different sort of politics into the House of Lords. Jenny brought it, but I'm an extra voice to do that. And there are some things that I really get to enjoy when we're talking about the agriculture bill and land use a lot at the moment, leaning across the chamber when we're physically in the chamber and saying land reform really loudly to the Tory hereditaries opposite, which is quite a lot of fun. But Britain's political system is just utterly broken, and we started off talking about A-levels, and that's just one case study of it. We need a modern, functional democratic constitution, and I know you've already talked about proportional representation in an earlier one of these events, but the weird thing is that the House of Lords is actually more representative and arguably more democratic than the Commons, because in the Commons the Tories have 100% of the power, having won 44% of the vote support from people who voted in 19, whereas actually in the House of Lords the crossbenchers, the non-party people, have the balance of power. So one of the problems is they keep saying, oh, we're the unelected house, so we can't overturn what the government's doing. But actually we have a real force and a real responsibility. I will be arguing when we're talking about the immigration bill, when we're talking about refugees, when we're talking about the climate emergency, that the Lords has to be the democratic force, weirdly enough, that the Commons isn't. And that will hopefully also be a way of pushing on to get the kind of reform we need, because if the question is what does the world need, the answer has to be, and this applies to the refugee crisis and people being able to stay in their home rather than being forced out, is the answer has to be democracy.
Absolutely, beautifully said. Thank you both so much for coming on. As always, we've run out of time and there's so many more questions to ask. I've just seen something pop up in the chat where someone's asking about the relationship between the Syrian civil war and the climate emergency, and that's a conversation we could probably have a few hours on. If you want to continue the conversation, though, please do find Natalie on Twitter at Natalie Bennett. Ahmed, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you on social media?
I mean, you have my Twitter handle, so it's Ahmed Al-Rashid 99. So that's it.
Perfect. So please do engage with them on Twitter or on social media too. Thank you both so much for coming on. Thank you everyone at home for watching. I'll see you all next week. Have a lovely week. Be excellent to each other, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.